After a series of disastrous Supreme Court rulings, including the granting of sweeping presidential immunity, President Biden has finally, formally, and publicly proposed major reforms to the Supreme Court. And on a Piers Morgan panel of all places, Morgan himself seemed skeptical about the composition of the court and Republicans' defense of it, and his guest, liberal streamer Destiny, shredded the two conservative guests on the panel about the Supreme Court and about presidential immunity, and it was all glorious. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, we have several clips to talk about in this video, and they are all from a recent Piers Morgan panel. We'll start with this one. I was actually kind of surprised. It was a welcome sight to see this allegedly nonpartisan journalist, who so happens 99 times out of 100 to align publicly with Trump and the Republicans, actually call out his Republican guests for their hypocrisy and the imbalanced nature of the Supreme Court.
The problem looking at it from the outside is that when you have, as Donald Trump found in his last term of office, the ability to pack the court with three of your own in one term, it does lead to an imbalance which you would be crying foul about if it was the other way around. What is the answer to that?
So he's speaking there to his right-wing guest, Officer Tatum, and he's on there with the red-headed libertarian or the libertarian redhead, one of the two, and they are engaging with Destiny about the Supreme Court and about presidential immunity, specifically the red-headed libertarian. And so Destiny speaks up in defense of the Supreme Court reforms that President Biden has proposed, which includes, number one, a constitutional amendment, which would make it very clear that no president, liberal, conservative, Democrat, or Republican, is above the law, and that they can be criminally prosecuted if they commit crimes while in office. That's one proposal. The second proposal is term limits, which would effectively rotate Supreme Court justices off the bench after 18 years of service and effectively grant every president, liberal, conservative, Democrat, Republican, two presidential nominees. And then the third reform endorsed by the president are a binding enforceable code of ethics, code of conduct, which would basically mirror what's already there in Congress, for Congress, the legislative branch. For members of Congress, they cannot accept gifts valued at $50 because the Congress wants to reduce corruption. They don't want to make it easy so that you can bribe Congress people or things like that. If you try to give a congressman something over $51 in value, they can't accept it. They want to impose, President Biden wants to impose those ethics requirements on the Supreme Court and make it enforceable. I think all of these ideas are good. I think there are even other ideas which are great, which were not proposed, but that's the context. And this is Destiny's defense of them to the conservative guests on Piers Morgan.
Yeah, so firstly, the idea that if you're a Democratic president and you get to nominate and have a Democratic Supreme Court justice, that's an interesting concept in theory. But I seem to remember that Obama had spent almost a year with a vacancy on the Supreme Court that McConnell explicitly said he was going to deny a hearing for, which was insane. The Democrats were robbed of a Supreme Court seating there. And who's to say if Republicans would ever seat a Supreme Court justice? Maybe next time it'll be 2 years before an election. And they're saying, well, maybe we should wait for the next election cycle. You have to keep in mind that when the court was created, the reason why there are lifetime appointments is because justices, Supreme Court justices, are supposed to be insulated from the political pressures relating to running again for office and all of the other things that go into having to keep in mind like an election season. However, all of that, as Cenk rightly pointed out, is completely destroyed if you are taking bribes or getting paid or getting some kind of compensation based perhaps on the way that you might rule in the court. So an ethics guideline, I don't know how anybody could be opposed to that. And the nice thing about term limits are people focus on term limits as like term limiting a person, which is fine, whatever. The nice thing about term limits isn't necessarily the term limit. It's that you could apportion so that every single president gets either 1 or 1.5 picks, depending upon what you actually put that term limit as, which I think everybody would agree would probably be fair. If every president was guaranteed the same number of Supreme Court picks, it means that the composition of the Supreme Court would roughly align with how Americans are voting for president, rather than this idea that, hey, maybe you'll get really lucky and one president, you know, if Trump were to win again, if Sotomayor were to, God forbid, die or step down, maybe Trump, one president, gets 4 Supreme Court picks, which is insane.
All great points, great defense. I'll say, as somebody who knows Destiny, I'm proud of him for doing this because he was very resistant for the longest time to any changes to the United States Supreme Court. So he seems more open to that. I think it's good. No institution is perfect. Institutions should not outlive their usefulness. And if they need to be changed or reformed or modified or scrapped entirely, as we've done with various institutions over the years, then so be it. we always need a court of last resort, and we'll get into my thoughts on the court at the end. But we always need a court of last resort. But this court has become too powerful and too rogue and too corrupt. If you are granted lifetime positions and you are effectively 9 philosopher kings, which get to impose your views on the American people by way of imposing your views on the Congress and the president, then you should have to be perfect. I'm sorry. You should have higher ethics. You should be held to a higher standard of ethics than even the president of the United States, because at least we can vote the president out every 4 years, and they're term limited to 2 terms, period, 8 years total. So there are more electoral public accountability controls on even the president than there are the Supreme Court justice. But obviously, the Supreme Court's not living up to that standard. So yes, there should, of course, be an enforceable, ruthless code of conduct such that their conduct is unimpeachable. And if they're going to behave like politicians, then they should have political controls forced on them, like term limits, like elections, like codes of ethics, like et cetera and so forth. You either need to pick one. If you want all the perks of being a judge, then you have to hold up your end of the social contract and act like a judge. You don't get to be partisan. You don't even get to hint at partisanship if you want to do that. If you want to wave MAGA flags, if you want to openly show your political affiliation, then go be a politician, go be a senator, go be a congressman, go be a president. Otherwise, you don't have the right to do that. And if you're going to flout that right, I do believe that the American people have a right to impose checks on you and to bring you to heel. As a reminder, the founding fathers did not intend for the Supreme Court of the United States to be equal to the Congress or the president, let alone more powerful. This idea that we have 3 co-equal branches is just not true. We have 3 separate branches, which are powerful and important, all of them. But the Supreme Court was clearly intended by the founding fathers to be the weakest and the least active of the branches, and that includes weaker than the president. So anyway, great job by Destiny in that respect as well. And then he has a back and forth with the libertarian redhead over presidential immunity when she tries to insinuate that actually presidential immunity is a good thing.
Also, it'd be unconstitutional to punish a president for performing his enumerated and implied powers. And SCOTUS, when they had said that they weren't going to criminalize this, SCOTUS had asked the lower courts to determine that scope, but no one's really talking about that part. It was SCOTUS had sent it back to the lower courts. They didn't just rule on it blindly.
That is completely and totally not true. This is misrepresented by conservatives so much. Okay, so there were 4 different actions that the court spoke about. Roberts ruled one of them is qualifying for absolute immunity. This first bucket of things that he's created, by the way, none of these things have existed historically. There are other things now. All of the other acts are presumed immune, meaning that the state or the government in this case has to bring a reason why they should be able to probe these actions in a way that will never damage the executive's ability to operate in the future, which encompasses all of the other actions that are spoken about in the Supreme Court case. The reason why they remanded some of that to the lower court was for the lower courts to now have that argument over the presumptive immunity. Criminal immunity has never existed in any size, shape, or form for any politician in this country in the history of the United States. And the idea that a U.S. president, that we came from a rebellion against a king, that our president is now criminally immune for performing his duties, why would we ever assume that he needs that type of immunity?
That's not true.
Is true.
When was the president immune for criminal immunity?
There's a process for
I don't even know. Wait, when was the president immune from criminal immunity?
There's a process for when a president commits a crime, and that process is outlined in Article 1.
I'm sorry,
to impeach
what is
him.
that process?
Look.
Hold on. No. Impeachment has nothing to do with criminal liability.
So when a president
with all due respect, you have no idea what the structure of our government is. I'm so sorry, okay? Impeachment is a political process that you use to unseat somebody, and once they're unseated, you can prevent them from holding future office. If you listen to Benjamin Franklin, for instance, talk about impeachment was created so that you didn't have to either assassinate or fabricate criminal charges to remove somebody from office. Impeachment has nothing to do with criminal liability. The maximum conviction sentence you can get for being impeached is just being removed from office and prevented from taking seat in future office.
He's correct. So the fact of the matter is we have never understood, constitutional scholars, historians have never understood impeachment to mean to be a prerequisite. There's this idea that's now being peddled by an increasingly vocal minority in the Trump-aligned fringe that no, you actually have to impeach a president successfully. You have to impeach them in the House, convict them with 2/3 supermajority in the Senate, and then once they are successfully impeached and convicted, then you may prosecute them. That has never been understood to be the case for the president or any other executive officer. As a matter of fact, the language of the Constitution makes it very clear that if you impeach somebody for an impeachable offense is treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Let's say bribery, right? That's an impeachable offense. It's also a crime, right? You can be criminally prosecuted for bribery as well if you're a public official, right? So it's an impeachable offense and separately a criminal violation. You can impeach an elected official for bribery and remove them from office. But the Constitution says if you do that, you can also prosecute them for bribery too. But the impeachment has never been required first. That has never been the understanding of it. There is no history to support that throughout the United States of America. As a matter of fact, when President Ford pardoned former President Richard Nixon, Nixon had neither been impeached nor convicted in the Senate. But he was pardoned anyway because both Ford and Nixon and everyone involved understood that Nixon was still prosecutable, even though he'd never been impeached or convicted. So this person's just simply wrong, and Destiny is just absolutely correct. Also, again, going back to the presidential immunity thing, I think it's super gross and weird and pathetic, and certainly un-American for anyone to defend criminal immunity for really anybody, but for the president of the United States as well. Piers Morgan has flirted with it in the past. He's expressed support with it. He doesn't in this episode, thank God. Actually, part of me kind of hoped that he did, so he and Destiny could go back and forth on it. Piers Morgan is British. Piers Morgan is actually a monarchist, so he's not a Republican. He supports the monarchy. And listen, whatever, if you want to be ruled by a sovereign monarch, so be it. But we rebelled from a sovereign monarch. We rebelled from King George III. That was the Revolutionary War. And one of, if not the single most important thoughts of the Constitutional Convention when the Constitution was drafted and ratified, there were many important beliefs. There were many important principles, but probably the single most important one is we weren't going to have a king. The president is merely chief executive, and temporary at that, because they have to be elected and they're subject to re-elections. They don't get to serve for life. There's no divine right of kings. The sovereign, the king, King Charles in the United Kingdom, Queen Elizabeth's son, who is now the reigning sovereign, he's above the law. He cannot be prosecuted. He cannot be charged. He is truly the embodiment of, he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue, and under current British law, you can't prosecute, because in British law, the sovereign is the crown, and the crown is the source of law. That's why if you're prosecuted in the United Kingdom, they refer to it as the crown. Whereas here, we say the government is charging you, or the district attorney's office, and the crown is prosecuting you. The idea is the crown can't prosecute itself. We don't have that, folks. We shouldn't have that. We shouldn't want that. We're Americans. We have a president, someone with whom we invest temporarily enormous power and privilege, and we also have accountability of them. They have to be reelected. We can investigate them, and if they commit crimes while in office, when they leave office, we can prosecute. That has always been the understanding. The fact that people have elected not to do that could mean a couple of things. Number one, they didn't think the case could be made. Number two, perhaps the president in question didn't actually commit a crime. Number three, perhaps there was some inappropriate loyalty to the office of the president, but it was always an option on the table to prosecute a criminal rogue president. And the Supreme Court of the United States just disregarded it entirely, purely to benefit Donald Trump. It's gross. As someone who's a Democrat, I don't want any Democrat president, not President Clinton, not President Obama, not President Biden, and not, hopefully, future President Harris. I don't want my side to have it. You shouldn't want your side to have it either. None of us should want anybody to have it. It's really gross and weird and pathetic that so many Republicans really crave a sovereign God king cult leader. It's really gross and un-American. It should be made fun of relentlessly. So good on Destiny for showing up. Good on Destiny for pushing back. And he's currently, I think, literally as we speak, engaging in a back and forth Twitter meme war with this person who, for some reason, believes she won the debate. She didn't. Let me know what you think in the comments.